In the first courtyard of a ruined temple on the west bank of the Nile, a statue lies on its back. The statue is made of red granite. It weighs approximately 1,000 tons. It once stood roughly 19 meters tall, the height of a 6-story building. It depicted the pharaoh Ramesses II, seated on his throne, wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, his hands resting on his thighs, his face looking eastward toward the river and the rising sun. The statue was, at the time of its erection, one of the largest freestanding sculptures in the world, a monument to the power, the ambition, and the colossal self-regard of the pharaoh who built it. The statue is now in pieces. The head, the torso, the arms, the legs, all separated, all scattered across the courtyard floor, all lying in the sand and rubble of a temple that is itself in ruins. The face, one of the most famous faces in Egyptian art, stares at the sky from the debris, its expression composed, its features serene, its granite surface polished to a smoothness that time has not been able to dull. The statue has been lying here for thousands of years. No one knows exactly when it fell. An earthquake, probably, sometime in antiquity. No one attempted to re-erect it. The statue was too big, too heavy, too comprehensively shattered to be put back together, so it lies where it fell. 1,000 tons of red granite, arranged by gravity into the posture of a fallen giant. This statue, this shattered colossus, this toppled monument to the most powerful pharaoh in Egyptian history, inspired the most famous poem ever written about the ruins of the ancient world. In 1818, the English poet Percy Bysshe Shelley published a sonnet called Ozymandias, a meditation on the impermanence of power, on the vanity of rulers who believe that their monuments will last forever, and on the final triumph of time over ambition. The poem describes a traveller who encounters the ruins of a colossal statue in the desert, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone, a shattered visage lying in the sand, and an inscription on the pedestal. "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." The poem's devastating final lines deliver the moral: nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. The name Ozymandias is a Greek corruption of Eusomatra, the prenomen of Ramesses II. The statue is the Ozymandias Colossus, the temple is the Ramesseum, and the moral of impermanence, of the vanity of power, of the silence that swallows the boasts of kings, is written not in Shelley's words, but in the ruins themselves. The ruins speak. They say, "This was the greatest, this was the mightiest, this was the most powerful pharaoh in the history of Egypt, and this is what remains." By the end of tonight, you're going to understand what the Ramesseum was, not merely a mortuary temple, but an economic institution, a military archive, a theological statement, and one of the most ambitious building projects of the New Kingdom. You're going to understand the Battle of Kadesh, the most famous military engagement in Egyptian history, carved in extraordinary detail on the temple's walls. And you're going to understand why the pharaoh who built more monuments than any ruler in history is best remembered not for what he built, but for what fell down. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's begin. Ramesses II ruled Egypt for 66 years, from 1279 to 1213 BC, making his reign one of the longest in Egyptian history and one of the longest in the history of any monarchy anywhere in the world. He ascended the throne as a young man, probably in his early 20s, and he ruled until his death at approximately 90 years of age. During those 66 years, he transformed Egypt, militarily, diplomatically, architecturally, and culturally, in ways that would define the country for centuries after his death. The building program of Ramesses II was the most extensive in Egyptian history. He built or expanded temples at virtually every major site in the Nile Valley: at Thebes, at Memphis, at Abydos, at Abu Simbel, at Luxor, at Karnak, at Ramesses, his new capital in the Delta, and at dozens of smaller sites from Nubia to the Mediterranean. He erected more statues of himself than any pharaoh before or after, colossal figures that bore his name and his likeness from one end of Egypt to the other. He inscribed his cartouche on the monuments of his predecessors, a practice that amounted, in some cases, to usurpation, the appropriation of other pharaohs' buildings under his own name. The scale of his construction activity was so vast that a significant percentage of the surviving monumental architecture in the Nile Valley bears his name. Not always because he built it, but often because he inscribed it. The Ramesseum, called by the ancient Egyptians the temple of millions of years of Usamatra Setepenra united with Thebes, was Ramesses's mortuary temple, the building that was designed to sustain his cult after his death. The temple was built on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, in the Theban necropolis, roughly opposite the modern city of Luxor. Construction began around 1270 BC and took approximately 20 years to complete. The temple was designed and executed by two of Ramesses's most accomplished architects, Penre of Coptos and Amenemene of Abydos, and it followed the standard plan of New Kingdom mortuary temples, with significant innovations in scale, decoration, and subsidiary structures. The temple complex covered an area of approximately 10 hectares, roughly 183 meters long by 67 meters wide for the main temple structure, surrounded by an extensive precinct of mud brick subsidiary buildings. The main temple comprised two stone pylons, massive trapezoidal gateways, each roughly 60 meters wide, two open courtyards, a 48-column hypostyle hall, and a series of inner sanctuaries dedicated to the gods Amun, Ra, and Ptah, as well as to the deified Ramesses himself. The name Ramesseum was coined by Jean-François Champollion, the decipherer of the hieroglyphs, who visited the temple in 1829 and correctly identified the ruins as those of Ramesses II's mortuary temple. Before Champollion's identification, the temple was known to European visitors as the Tomb of Ozymandias, the name used by the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, who visited the site in the 1st century BC and who recorded an inscription that he attributed to the pharaoh. I am Ozymandias, king of kings. If any would know how great I am and where I lie, let him surpass me in some of my exploits. The Battle of Kadesh, which Ramesses commemorated on the walls of the Ramesseum with more detail and more enthusiasm than any other event of his reign, was one of the largest chariot battles in the ancient world. The engagement, fought in 1274 BC near the city of Kadesh on the Orontes River in what is now western Syria, pitted the Egyptian army, led personally by Ramesses, against the forces of the Hittite Empire, led by King Muwatalli II. The scale of the battle was enormous. Modern estimates suggest that the combined forces may have numbered as many as 50,000 men and 5,000 chariots, making it one of the largest military engagements of the Bronze Age. The battle began badly for the Egyptians. Ramesses, leading the advanced division of his army, was deceived by two Hittite spies, who falsely reported that the Hittite army was far to the north. Ramesses pushed forward with his lead division, leaving the other three divisions strung out along the march route, separated by kilometers of open terrain. The Hittites, who were actually concealed behind the city of Kadesh, launched a massive chariot attack against the Egyptian 2nd Division, shattering it and sending its survivors fleeing toward Ramesses's camp. The Hittite chariots swept into the Egyptian camp, catching Ramesses and his bodyguard in a near-complete encirclement. The situation was desperate. The pharaoh, according to his own account, was abandoned by his troops, surrounded by enemies, and faced with certain death. And then, in the version of events that Ramesses's scribes recorded and that Ramesses's sculptors carved on the walls of the Ramesseum, the pharaoh rallied. He invoked the god Amun. He charged into the enemy ranks, and he personally, single-handedly, according to the reliefs, turned the tide of the battle. The arriving 3rd and 4th divisions reinforced the pharaoh's position, and the Hittite attack was repulsed. The reliefs at the Ramesseum depict this narrative in extraordinary visual detail. The scenes cover the entire surface of the first pylon and extend into the first courtyard, a continuous pictorial narrative that begins with the Egyptian army on the march, proceeds through the Hittite ambush, the encirclement, the pharaoh's heroic stand, and the final repulse of the enemy. The composition is dynamic. Horses gallop, chariots career, arrows fly, soldiers fall. The pharaoh is depicted at colossal scale, his figure towering above the battle, his bow drawn, his chariot horses straining forward, his enemies tumbling beneath his wheels. The depiction is propaganda, a calculated exaggeration of the pharaoh's personal role in the battle. But the propaganda is artistically effective. The Kadesh reliefs are among the most vivid and most energetic military compositions in Egyptian art. The comparison between the Egyptian and the Hittite accounts of the battle, the Egyptian version preserved at the Ramesseum and other temples, the Hittite version preserved in cuneiform tablets discovered at the Hittite capital of Hattusa, reveals the gap between propaganda and reality. The Egyptian account presents the battle as a glorious victory, a personal triumph of the pharaoh over the forces of chaos. The Hittite account presents the battle as a Hittite victory, or at least a successful defense of Kadesh against Egyptian aggression. The truth, as reconstructed by modern historians using both sources, lies somewhere between the two. The battle was an indecisive engagement in which neither side achieved its strategic objectives, after which both sides withdrew and eventually negotiated the peace treaty that ended the conflict. The Treaty of Kadesh, signed in 1258 BC, 16 years after the battle, was a diplomatic achievement that Ramesses commemorated with as much pride as the battle itself. The treaty, of which copies survive in both Egyptian and Hittite versions, established mutual non-aggression, mutual defense against third-party threats, and the extradition of political refugees. The treaty was sealed by a royal marriage. Ramesses married a Hittite princess who was given the Egyptian name Mathor-Neferu and who became one of the pharaoh's many wives. The marriage consolidated the peace and established a personal bond between the two royal houses that endured for the remainder of Ramesses's reign. The construction of the Ramesseum itself was a project of considerable logistical complexity. The temple was built from locally quarried sandstone, the standard building material for Upper Egyptian temples, with red granite from Aswan used for the colossal statues and for selected architectural elements. The quarrying, transportation, and erection of the Ozymandias Colossus, a single block of red granite weighing approximately 1,000 tons, was an engineering achievement comparable to the erection of the Colossi of Memnon at Amenhotep III's mortuary temple nearby. The logistics required the quarrying of the block at Aswan, its transport by barge down the Nile for roughly 200 kilometers, its unloading on the west bank, its overland transport to the temple site, and its erection in the first courtyard, a process that took months or years and that employed hundreds of workers. The stone pylons of the Ramesseum were an innovation. For the first time in the history of Egyptian mortuary temple construction, the pylons were built from stone rather than from mud brick. Previous mortuary temples had used mud brick for their pylons, a cheaper, faster, and easier construction method that was, however, far less durable than stone. Ramesses's decision to use stone pylons was a statement of permanence, a declaration that his temple would outlast the mud brick temples of his predecessors. The irony is, again, evident. The stone pylons have survived better than the mud brick ones, but they have not survived intact. Earthquakes have toppled portions of both pylons, and the first pylon's gateway is now supported by modern concrete reinforcements. The core problem of the Ramesseum is the problem of the relationship between ambition and survival, between the pharaoh who built more than anyone else and the temple that has survived less well than many others. Ramesses II was the most prolific builder in Egyptian history. His monuments are everywhere. His name is on everything. His face, reproduced in colossal statues from Abu Simbel to Memphis, is the most recognizable face in Egyptian art. And yet his mortuary temple, the building that was supposed to sustain his cult for eternity, the temple that was designed to be his most important monument, the building that he called the Temple of Millions of Years, is in ruins. The pylons have collapsed. The courtyard walls are fragmentary. The hypostyle hall has lost 19 of its original 48 columns. The colossal statue that stood in the first courtyard has fallen. The temple that was built to last forever has not lasted. The irony is devastating, and Shelley saw it. The pharaoh who boasted of his works, who claimed to be the greatest builder in history, who inscribed his name on every available surface, has left a mortuary temple that is significantly less well preserved than the temples of his predecessors. The Temple of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahari, built more than a century before the Ramesseum, is better preserved. The Temple of Seti I at Abydos, built by Ramesses' own father, is better preserved. The Temple of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu, built by a successor who consciously modelled his temple on the Ramesseum, is far better preserved. The pharaoh who built the most has left the least. But here's the problem. The Ramesseum's poor state of preservation is not evidence of poor construction. The temple was well built. Its stone was carefully quarried. Its reliefs were competently carved. Its architecture was sound. The Ramesseum's vulnerability was not a product of its construction quality. It was a product of its location, like the mortuary temple of Amenhotep III, which was built on the same floodplain and which suffered the same fate. The Ramesseum was positioned on low-lying ground that was vulnerable to the annual Nile flood. The flood saturated the temple's foundations, weakened its mud brick subsidiary structures, and contributed to the eventual collapse of its stone superstructure. And it gets worse. The earthquakes that periodically struck the Theban region compounded the flood damage, shaking the already weakened structures, toppling the already destabilized statues, and accelerating the collapse of the already compromised walls. The Ozymandias Colossus, the 1,000-ton red granite statue that lies shattered in the first courtyard, was almost certainly toppled by an earthquake. The force required to bring down a 19-meter-tall granite statue of that mass is enormous. Far greater than any human force, far greater than anything that erosion or flooding could produce. Only an earthquake, a sudden, violent lateral acceleration of the ground on which the statue stood, could have generated the force necessary to topple a monument of that scale. The fallen colossus has been lying in the first courtyard for at least 2,000 years. Long enough for Diodorus Siculus to see it when he visited in the 1st century BC, long enough for Shelley to hear about it when he wrote his poem in 1818. The statue's fall is the most famous single event in the Ramesseum's history, the moment when the pharaoh's greatest monument became the pharaoh's most eloquent rebuke. The statue that was supposed to demonstrate his power demonstrates, in its fallen state, the limits of that power. The monument that was supposed to last forever lasted for roughly 1,000 years before an earthquake brought it down, and the inscription, "I am Ozymandias, King of Kings," which was supposed to inspire awe, inspires instead a melancholy awareness that even the mightiest achievements of human ambition are, in the end, temporary. Ramesses II's 66-year reign was long enough to produce not merely a building program, but a cultural transformation. When he ascended the throne, Egypt was a powerful but anxious state, still recovering from the disruptions of the Amarna period, still uncertain about its relationships with the Hittites and the other Near Eastern powers, still working out the implications of the dynastic transition from the 18th to the 19th dynasty. When he died, 66 years later, Egypt was the most stable, the most confident, and the most architecturally impressive civilization in the known world. Its temples rebuilt, its borders secured, its diplomatic relationships formalized, its cultural identity expressed in a monumental program that covered the Nile Valley from end to end. The pharaoh's longevity had practical consequences for his building program. A pharaoh who ruled for 66 years could plan, begin, and complete projects that a shorter-lived pharaoh could only dream of. Abu Simbel, the rock-cut temple in Nubia, with its 4 colossal seated statues of Ramesses, each one roughly 20 meters tall, took approximately 20 years to carve. The Ramesseum took approximately 20 years to build. The additions to Karnak, the completion of the Great Hypostyle Hall, with its 134 columns, which had been begun by Seti I, took decades. These projects were possible only because Ramesses lived long enough to see them through. A pharaoh who ruled for 15 years, like his father Seti, could begin a project of this scale. A pharaoh who ruled for 66 years could complete it. The longevity also had personal consequences. Ramesses outlived most of the people who had been born during his reign. He outlived his first wife, the famous Nefertari, whose tomb in the Valley of the Queens is one of the most beautifully decorated burials in Egypt. He outlived at least 12 of his sons, including several crown princes who were designated as his heirs and who predeceased him. By the time of his death, at roughly 90 years of age, Ramesses was a living legend, a pharaoh who had been on the throne for longer than most of his subjects had been alive, a ruler whose reign had become synonymous with Egypt itself. The Ramesseum's decorative program reflects this personal and political longevity. The temple is not merely a mortuary complex, it is a biography in stone, a visual narrative of the pharaoh's life, from his military campaigns to his religious observances, from his relationships with the gods to his relationships with his family. The Battle of Kadesh reliefs are the most prominent element of this biography, the military episode that Ramesses considered the defining event of his reign, and that he commemorated on the walls of virtually every major temple he built. But the Ramesseum also contains scenes of other campaigns, the Syrian wars, the Libyan campaigns, and a reference to the capture of a city called Shalem, which some scholars have identified with Jerusalem, as well as scenes of religious festivals, divine offerings, and the pharaoh's relationship with the major gods of the Egyptian pantheon. The reference to Shalem found on a block atop the first pylon is one of the most debated details in the Ramesseum's inscriptions. If the identification with Jerusalem is correct, the inscription would constitute one of the earliest Egyptian references to the city, predating the biblical account of the Exodus by several centuries and providing independent evidence for Egyptian military activity in the region of Canaan during the 13th century BC. The identification is not universally accepted. Other scholars have proposed alternative identifications for the city, but the possibility that the Ramesseum contains a reference to Jerusalem has added a layer of religious and historical significance to the temple that extends beyond the realm of Egyptology. The hypostyle hall of the Ramesseum, the great columned space that lies beyond the second courtyard, is the most impressive surviving architectural element of the temple. The hall originally contained 48 columns, arranged in 6 rows of 8, supporting a stone roof that has now collapsed. 29 of the original columns are still standing, a survival rate of roughly 60% that is sufficient to convey the spatial character of the original hall. The columns are massive, the central ones roughly 10 meters tall, topped with open papyrus capitals, their shafts decorated with sunk reliefs and inscriptions. The side columns are shorter, roughly 6 meters tall, topped with closed papyrus bud capitals, creating the clerestory effect that admitted light through the gap between the high central ceiling and the low side aisles. The clerestory lighting was a standard feature of New Kingdom hypostyle halls, used at Karnak, at the Ramesseum, and at several other temples. The technique involves building the central rows of columns higher than the surrounding rows, creating a vertical gap between the central roof and the side roofs through which light can enter. The entering light illuminates the central nave while leaving the side aisles in shadow, creating a dramatic contrast between light and dark that enhances the atmospheric quality of the interior. The technique is functionally identical to the clerestory lighting used in medieval European cathedrals, a convergence of design solutions that reflects the universal architectural challenge of admitting light to a roofed interior without sacrificing the structural integrity of the walls. The smaller second hypostyle hall, located behind the Great Hall, closer to the sanctuary, is sometimes called the astronomical hall because of its partially preserved ceiling decoration. The ceiling, painted with golden stars on a deep blue background, depicts the night sky. The celestial dome that arched over the inner temple, connecting the earthly building to the cosmic order that it was designed to maintain. The astronomical ceiling is fragmentary. Much of the original painted surface has been lost to the collapse of the roof and the subsequent exposure to the elements, but enough survives to demonstrate the quality of the original decoration and to confirm that the Ramesseum's interior was, like the interior of every Egyptian temple, a painted cosmos, every surface covered with images, inscriptions, and symbolic compositions that transformed the stone building into a model of the universe. The sanctuary area, the innermost chambers of the temple, where the cult statues of the deified Ramesses and the major gods were housed, is now largely destroyed. The sanctuary was dedicated to the gods Amun-Ra, Ra-Horakhti, and Ptah, the three principal deities of the Egyptian state religion, as well as to the deified Ramesses himself. The inclusion of these three gods, the Theban, the Heliopolitan, and the Memphite deities, in a single sanctuary was a political statement as well as a theological one. It declared that the Ramesseum served not merely the local Theban cult of Amun, but the entire national religious system, representing all three of the major theological traditions that constituted the Egyptian state religion. Walk through the Ramesseum from front to back, from the ruined pylons to the standing columns, from the fallen colossus to the vaulted storerooms, from the battle reliefs to the astronomical ceiling. The first pylon, the eastern entrance to the temple, is badly damaged. An earthquake has toppled portions of the structure, and the gateway is now supported by modern concrete reinforcements. But enough of the pylon's decorated surface survives to show the scenes that Ramesses chose to display at the entrance to his temple. The Battle of Kadesh. The battle, fought in 1274 BC against the Hittite Empire, near the city of Kadesh on the Orontes River in modern Syria, was the defining military event of Ramesses's reign and the event that he chose to commemorate most prominently on his monuments. The Kadesh reliefs at the Ramesseum are among the most extensive and most detailed depictions of ancient warfare in Egyptian art, showing the Egyptian army on the march, the Hittite chariot charge, the chaos of the battle, and of course, the pharaoh himself, standing in his chariot, firing his bow, single-handedly routing the enemy forces. The Battle of Kadesh was, by modern historical analysis, not the clear Egyptian victory that Ramesses's reliefs suggest. The battle was, at best, a tactical draw. The Egyptians survived a Hittite ambush and fought their way to a stalemate, after which both sides withdrew without achieving their strategic objectives. The battle was followed, 16 years later, by the Treaty of Kadesh, the oldest surviving peace treaty in history, in which Egypt and Hatti agreed to mutual non-aggression, mutual defense, and the extradition of political refugees. The treaty, which was signed in 1258 BC and which was sealed by a royal marriage between Ramesses and a Hittite princess, was a diplomatic triumph that Ramesses commemorated with as much enthusiasm as he had commemorated the military engagement. But on the walls of the Ramesseum, the battle is presented not as a draw but as a glorious victory, a personal triumph of the pharaoh over the forces of chaos, a divine endorsement of Egyptian power, a demonstration that the gods stood with Ramesses and that his enemies were doomed to defeat. The presentation is propaganda, a calculated distortion of the historical record designed to serve the pharaoh's political interests. And the propaganda is effective, so effective that for more than 3,000 years, the Battle of Kadesh was understood primarily through Ramesses's version of events, and the reality of the battle's indecisive outcome was not fully appreciated until modern historians gained access to Hittite as well as Egyptian sources. Enter the first courtyard. The space is dominated by the fallen colossus, the Ozymandias statue, lying on its back, its pieces scattered across the courtyard floor. The statue was carved from a single block of red Aswan granite, quarried at Aswan, transported nearly 200 kilometers downriver to Thebes, carved at the temple site, and erected in the courtyard as the centerpiece of the temple's public program. The logistics of creating and installing a 1,000-ton granite statue are staggering, requiring months of quarry work, specialized transport barges, hundreds of laborers, and a system of ramps and levers for the final erection. Pass through the second pylon into the second courtyard. This space is better preserved than the first. It retains portions of its Osiride portico, with pillar statues of Ramesses in the wrap-body posture of Osiris, standing against the pillars of the colonnade. The Osiride statues represent Ramesses as Osiris, the god of the dead, the ruler of the underworld, a theological identification that was fundamental to the mortuary temple's purpose. The living pharaoh was Horus, the dead pharaoh was Osiris, and the mortuary temple was the building that facilitated the transition, the place where the living king became the dead god, where Horus became Osiris, where the ruler of Egypt became the ruler of the underworld. Beyond the second courtyard lies the great hypostyle hall, the most impressive surviving element of the Ramesseum. The hall originally contained 48 columns, arranged in rows, supporting a stone roof that admitted light through clerestory windows. 29 of the original 48 columns are still standing, their papyrus bud capitals intact, their surfaces decorated with reliefs and inscriptions, their shafts painted with the coloured patterns of papyrus and lotus that symbolize the unity of Upper and Lower Egypt. The central columns, taller than the surrounding ones, created a raised nave that admitted light through the gap between the high central ceiling and the lower side aisles, a design that is also used at Karnak and that produces a dramatic contrast between the lit nave and the shadowed aisles. Behind the hypostyle hall, a smaller second hypostyle hall, sometimes called the astronomical hall, retains portions of its original ceiling decoration. The ceiling, painted with golden stars on a deep blue background, represents the night sky, the celestial dome above the divine realm of the inner temple. Portions of this astronomical decoration survive, providing evidence of the original colour scheme and confirming that the temple's interior was, when new, a blaze of colour, every surface painted, every relief highlighted, every hieroglyph filled with pigment. The mud brick storage magazines that surround the Ramesseum are, from an architectural perspective, among the most significant structures at the site, more significant, in some respects, than the stone temple they surround. The magazines are constructed from mud brick, sun-dried clay bricks, made from Nile mud mixed with straw, shaped in wooden moulds, and dried in the Egyptian sun. The bricks are not individually impressive, but the structures they form, long, narrow, vaulted chambers arranged in rows, their barrel-vaulted ceilings rising to a height of several meters, are genuine architectural achievements. The barrel vaults are constructed without formwork. Each course of brick is laid at a slight angle to the previous one, the bricks leaning against the end wall, each one supporting the next, creating a self-supporting arch that does not require temporary wooden scaffolding during construction. This technique, the construction of true arches without formwork, was one of the most significant structural innovations of the ancient world. The technique was known to the Egyptians for centuries before the Ramesseum was built, but the Ramesseum's storerooms contain some of the most extensive and best preserved examples of the technique in Egypt. The vaulted magazines are among the oldest surviving true arches in the world, predating the Roman use of the arch by more than 1,000 years, and demonstrating that the structural principles that the Romans would later develop into a comprehensive architectural system were understood and applied by Egyptian builders centuries before Rome was founded. The economic function of the storerooms was central to the temple's operation. The Ramesseum was not merely a house of worship, it was an economic institution, a corporation in modern terms that owned land, employed workers, produced goods, and distributed resources. The temple's agricultural estates, parcels of cultivated land, distributed across the Theban region, and managed by the temple's administrative hierarchy, produced the grain that was stored in the granaries, the wine that was stored in the cellars, the linen that was stored in the textile rooms, and the oil that was stored in the oil magazines. The products of these estates were used for three purposes: to fund the daily ritual, the offerings to the gods, to pay the temple's employees, the priests, the scribes, the craftsmen, the laborers, and to accumulate surplus that could be exchanged for goods and services that the temple could not produce itself. Metals, exotic materials, imported luxury goods. The accounting system that managed these economic flows was sophisticated and well documented. Ostraka, pottery fragments and limestone fleece used as writing surfaces for informal records, have been recovered from the Ramesseum in large numbers, recording the quantities of grain received, stored, and distributed by the temple's administrators. The ostraka reveal a system of meticulous record-keeping. Every delivery was recorded, every distribution was documented, every surplus was accounted for. The system was bureaucratic in the best sense of the word. Orderly, systematic, transparent, and designed to prevent the theft and corruption that could undermine the temple's economic base. The Ramesseum Papyri, a cache of papyrus documents discovered in one of the temple's storerooms, are among the most important finds from the site. The papyri include literary texts, medical texts, and administrative documents that provide a window into the intellectual and institutional life of the temple. The medical papyrus, known as the Ramesseum medical papyrus, contains prescriptions and treatments for various ailments, including gynecological conditions, childhood diseases, and musculoskeletal injuries. The magical papyrus contains spells and incantations for protection against disease, misfortune, and malevolent spirits. The literary papyrus contains excerpts from canonical Egyptian literary works, stories, hymns, and wisdom texts that were used as teaching materials in the temple's scribal school. The discovery of the scribal school function is significant because it demonstrates that the Ramesseum's institutional life extended beyond the narrow confines of the mortuary cult. The temple was not merely a place where dead pharaoh rituals were performed. It was a living institution, a center of learning, of economic activity, of administrative management, of intellectual production. The scribal school produced literate officials who could manage the temple's economic operations, who could compose the letters and the accounts that the temple's administration required, and who could read and copy the literary and religious texts that constituted the Egyptian intellectual heritage. The discovery of the scribal materials dates primarily to the Third Intermediate Period, the era of political fragmentation that followed the end of the New Kingdom, roughly the 11th to the 8th centuries BC. This dating suggests that the Ramesseum continued to function as an institutional center for several centuries after the end of Ramesses's dynasty. Surviving the political disruptions of the late New Kingdom, the division of Egypt into rival kingdoms, and the decline of royal authority that characterized the Third Intermediate Period. The temple's economic base, its agricultural estates, its granaries, its distribution networks, may have provided the institutional stability that allowed the scribal school to continue operating even after the pharaoh's mortuary cult had declined. The mud brick magazines also contained evidence of the temple's role as a center of craft production. Workshops within the precinct produced the linen, the sandals, the pottery, and the other manufactured goods that the temple required for its daily operations. The workshops employed specialized craftsmen, weavers, potters, metalworkers, carpenters, who worked within the temple precinct and who were paid in grain from the temple's granaries. The craftsmen were not slaves. They were skilled workers, professionals who had been trained in their crafts, who possessed specialized knowledge and specialized tools, and who produced goods of a quality that was appropriate for use in the daily ritual. The integration of agricultural production, craft production, storage, distribution, and ritual performance within a single institutional framework is the defining characteristic of the Egyptian mortuary temple, and the Ramesseum is the most comprehensive surviving example of this integration. The building was not merely a temple, it was a self-contained economic unit, a small city capable of producing, storing, and distributing everything that the mortuary cult required without dependence on external suppliers or external funding. The mortuary temple was, in modern economic terms, a vertically integrated corporation controlling every stage of the production process, from the cultivation of the grain to the baking of the bread to the presentation of the offering to the god. The Ozymandias Colossus, the fallen statue of Ramesses II that lies in the first courtyard of the Ramesseum, has been the subject of fascination and contemplation since antiquity. Diodorus Siculus, the Greek historian who visited the site in the 1st century BC, described the statue in terms that suggest it was already fallen by the time of his visit. His account records the inscription that he attributed to the pharaoh, the boast about being the king of kings, the challenge to surpass his exploits, and his description of the ruins conveys a sense of melancholy that anticipates Shelley's poem by 18 centuries. The path from Diodorus's account to Shelley's poem passes through a series of intermediaries. The most important was the Italian adventurer Giovanni Battista Belzoni, who visited the Ramesseum in 1816, and who, at the request of the British consul Henry Salt, attempted to remove the head and torso of a smaller granite statue of Ramesses, now known as the Younger Memnon, from the second courtyard. Belzoni's account of his efforts, published in 1820, was widely read in England and may have inspired Shelley and his friend Horace Smith to write their respective sonnets about the ruins of the statue. Shelley's Ozymandias was published in January of 1818, roughly a year and a half after Belzoni began his excavations. The younger Memnon, the bust that Belzoni removed, is now one of the most famous objects in the British Museum. It is a fragment of a colossal granite statue of Ramesses II. The upper torso and head, weighing roughly 7 tons, carved with the same red Aswan granite as the larger Ozymandias Colossus. The removal of the bust, achieved by Belzoni through a combination of rollers, levers, and brute force over a period of several weeks, using a team of local workers, was one of the earliest and most controversial acts of antiquities removal in the history of Egyptology. The bust was shipped to England, where it arrived in 1818, and it has been on display in the British Museum ever since. The Ozymandias Colossus itself, the larger statue, the 1,000-ton seated figure that lies shattered in the first courtyard, was never moved. It was too large, too heavy, too comprehensively destroyed to be transported. The statue remains where it fell, its torso lying on its back, its head turned to one side, its arms broken from the body, its legs separated from the torso, its throne shattered into fragments. The scattered pieces cover a large area of the first courtyard, a field of red granite, polished and carved, lying in the sand and rubble of a temple that is itself in pieces. The experience of walking among the fragments of the Ozymandias Colossus is one of the most affecting experiences in the Theban necropolis. The scale of the fragments is overwhelming. The torso alone is several meters long. The arms are thicker than a human body. The feet are larger than a dining table. The visitor, walking among these colossal fragments, is dwarfed by the pieces of a statue that was dwarfed by nothing. The experience produces, simultaneously, a sense of awe at the scale of the original, and a sense of melancholy at the completeness of its destruction. The statue was the biggest, the ruin is the most complete. And the combination, the biggest and the most complete, the most ambitious and the most shattered, is the essence of the Ramesseum's meaning. The Festival of Min, another major scene depicted on the Ramesseum's walls, adds another dimension to the temple's decorative program. The Festival of Min was an annual celebration of the fertility god Min, a deity associated with agriculture, with procreation, and with the pharaoh's masculine potency. The Ramesseum reliefs depicting the Festival of Min show the pharaoh participating in the festival rituals, walking in procession, making offerings, performing the ritual actions that were designed to ensure the fertility of the land and the continuation of the royal line. The Min festival scenes are among the most detailed depictions of this celebration in Egyptian art, providing valuable information about the ritual program, the processional order, and the ceremonial objects used in the festival. The second courtyard of the Ramesseum, the better preserved of the two courtyards, retains its Osiride portico, a colonnade of pillar statues representing Ramesses as Osiris. The Osiride figures, each one standing against a pillar, their arms crossed over their chests in the wrapped body posture of the mummified Osiris, their faces bearing the serene expression of the dead god, create an atmosphere of solemnity and finality that is appropriate to the temple's mortuary function. The Osiride figures represent the pharaoh in his afterlife form, no longer the living warrior who fought at Kadesh, no longer the active builder who constructed the temple, but the dead king, transformed into Osiris, ruling the underworld, receiving the offerings that sustain his eternal existence. The transition from the battle scenes of the first pylon to the Osiride figures of the second courtyard is a theological journey, a journey from life to death, from the military triumphs of the living pharaoh to the divine authority of the dead one. The first pylon shows Ramesses as Horus, the living god, the warrior, the defender of Egypt. The second courtyard shows Ramesses as Osiris, the dead god, the ruler of the underworld, the judge of souls. The transition is the purpose of the mortuary temple, the facilitation of the pharaoh's transformation from Horus to Osiris, from the living to the dead, from the ruler of Egypt to the ruler of the afterlife. The transformation was achieved through ritual, the daily and the annual rituals that the priests performed in the temple's inner sanctuaries. The daily ritual involved the opening of the shrine, the washing and anointing of the cult statue, the presentation of offerings, and the recitation of hymns and prayers. The annual rituals including the beautiful Festival of the Valley, in which the statue of Amun was carried across the Nile from Karnak to visit the mortuary temples of the West Bank, involved processions, music, feasting, and the renewal of the pharaoh's relationship with the gods. The rituals were repetitive, the same actions performed every day, every year, every decade, every century. The repetition was the mechanism. The offering sustained the car sustained the pharaoh's afterlife, and the temple, the building that housed the ritual, that stored the offerings, that employed the priests, was the machine that kept the mechanism running. The Ramesseum sanctuary, the innermost chamber, the Holy of Holies, where the cult statue of the deified Ramesses resided, is now largely destroyed. The sanctuary was the smallest and the most sacred room in the temple, a dark, enclosed space, accessible only to the highest-ranking priests, where the golden statue of the pharaoh received its daily offerings in solitude and in silence. The destruction of the sanctuary, by earthquake, by flooding, by the slow, patient, relentless forces that have been dismantling the Ramesseum for 3,200 years, is the most theologically significant loss at the site. The sanctuary was the heart of the temple. The heart is gone, and the body, the pylons, the courtyards, the hypostyle hall, the storerooms, survives without it, like a house whose most important room has been removed. The royal palace, a small structure attached to the south side of the first courtyard, is another distinctive feature of the Ramesseum's plan. The palace was not a residence. Ramesses lived at his capital, not at his mortuary temple. The palace was a ceremonial structure, a building where the pharaoh could rest during visits to the temple, where he could change his regalia before ritual performances, and where he could receive officials and petitioners in a setting that combined architectural grandeur with religious authority. The palace had its own entrance, its own throne room, and its own suite of auxiliary chambers, a miniature royal court attached to the temple, available for use during the pharaoh's periodic visits to the West Bank. The palace's existence at the Ramesseum confirms the complexity of the mortuary temple as an institution. The temple was not merely a place of worship. It was a center of royal authority, a building where the pharaoh exercised his administrative and judicial functions, where he received foreign ambassadors and domestic officials, where he displayed the symbols of his power to the priests, the courtiers, and the pilgrims who visited the temple. The palace was the administrative annex, the temple was the sacred core, and the combination, the administrative and the sacred, the political and the theological, the palace and the temple, constituted a comprehensive institutional complex that served every function of the pharaoh's authority, both in life and in death. The Kadesh reliefs at the Ramesseum deserve special attention, not merely as historical documents, but as examples of a literary visual genre that Ramesses II essentially invented, the monumental battle narrative. Before Ramesses, Egyptian temple decoration included battle scenes, pharaohs smiting enemies, armies besieging cities, captives being led before the throne. But these earlier scenes were generic, stock compositions that depicted the pharaoh's military prowess in general terms, without narrating a specific engagement in chronological sequence. Ramesses's Kadesh reliefs are different. They tell a story, a specific story, with a beginning, a middle, and an end, narrated in both text and image across a vast expanse of wall space. The narrative begins with the Egyptian army on the march, 4 divisions, each named after a god, Amun-Ra, Ptah, and Seth, moving northward through Canaan toward the Orontes River. The reliefs show the army in column of march, infantry, chariots, baggage trains, and the pharaoh's personal bodyguard. The depiction is detailed, individual soldiers are distinguishable, the chariots are rendered with technical accuracy. The landscape is indicated through stylized representations of trees, rivers, and hills. The narrative continues with the deception, the arrival of 2 Bedouin deserters, actually Hittite spies, who falsely inform Ramesses that the Hittite army is far to the north. Ramesses, trusting the intelligence, pushes forward with his lead division, setting up camp near Kadesh without waiting for the other 3 divisions to close up. The Hittite army, concealed behind the city, launches a surprise attack on the 2nd division, the division of Ra, which is strung out along the march route and is caught in the open. The narrative reaches its climax with the attack on the camp. The Hittite chariots sweep into the Egyptian camp, catching Ramesses and his bodyguard in a near-complete encirclement. The reliefs show the chaos, the overturned camp equipment, the fleeing soldiers, the Hittite chariots crashing through the Egyptian lines. And then, the reversal. Ramesses rallies. He invokes Amun. He charges into the enemy, and the enemy, struck by the pharaoh's divine fury, retreats. The narrative concludes with the aftermath, the counting of the enemy dead, measured, in Egyptian custom, by the severed hands of the slain, the presentation of captives to the pharaoh, and the pharaoh's triumphal return to Egypt. The entire narrative covers the full surface of the first pylon and extends into the first and second courtyards, a continuous visual story that spans dozens of meters of wall space and that required months of planning, sketching and carving to produce. The literary version of the Kadesh narrative, known as the Poem of Pentor, after the scribe who copied one version, supplements the visual reliefs with a textual account that is one of the longest and most detailed military narratives in Egyptian literature. The poem, which exists in multiple copies on papyrus and on temple walls, describes the battle in the first person, the pharaoh narrating his own experience of the engagement, his invocation of Amun, his single-handed counterattack, and his ultimate triumph. The poem is propaganda. It is also literature, a composition of genuine literary quality, with dramatic pacing, vivid imagery, and a narrative structure that builds from crisis to resolution with the skill of an experienced storyteller. The combination of the visual reliefs and the literary poem creates a multimedia narrative, a story told simultaneously in images and in words, in carved stone and in written text, on the walls of the temple and on the papyrus rolls of the scribal archives. The multimedia approach was innovative. No previous pharaoh had combined visual and literary narratives of a single event with such comprehensiveness and such coordination. And the approach was influential. Subsequent pharaohs, including Ramesses III at Medinet Habu, would adopt the same approach, creating similar multimedia battle narratives that combined reliefs and texts to tell the stories of their military achievements. The innovation extended to the composition of the reliefs themselves. The Kadesh reliefs at the Ramesseum include what are sometimes described as bird's eye or map-like views of the battlefield, compositions in which the scene is depicted not from the traditional Egyptian side view, but from a quasi-aerial perspective, showing the disposition of the Egyptian and Hittite forces across the landscape, the position of the camp, the course of the river, and the layout of the city of Kadesh. These map-like compositions are unprecedented in Egyptian art. There is no earlier example of this kind of spatial representation in the pharaonic tradition. The compositions suggest that the artists who designed the Kadesh reliefs were working from some kind of battlefield diagram or sketch map, a planning document that showed the spatial relationships between the various elements of the engagement, and that the artists translated into the visual language of temple relief. The artistic quality of the Kadesh reliefs at the Ramesseum is high, though not as high as the reliefs at Seti's temple at Abydos. The Ramesseum reliefs are carved in sunk relief, Ramesses's preferred technique, and they display the characteristics of Ramesside sunk relief at its best. Bold outlines, dynamic compositions, a sense of movement and energy that makes the battle scenes feel alive. The horses are particularly well executed, their muscles taut, their legs extended, their manes flying in the wind of the charge. The chariots are rendered with technical accuracy. The wheels, the axles, the body of the vehicle, and the harness equipment are all depicted in correct detail, and the pharaoh, standing in his chariot, his bow drawn, his body turned toward the enemy, is the compositional center of every battle scene, the largest figure, the most prominently positioned, the visual anchor around which the chaos of the battle revolves. The Kadesh narrative at the Ramesseum is then not merely a historical record, it is an artistic achievement, a work of visual storytelling that combines narrative structure, technical skill, and propagandistic purpose in a composition that covers the entrance to the temple, that greets every visitor with the story of the pharaoh's greatest military adventure, and that demonstrates, in the most visible and most public space of the building, the nature of the pharaoh's authority. the authority of the warrior, the authority of the divine champion, the authority of the man who stood alone against the enemy and who prevailed through the intervention of the gods. The authority is asserted. The authority is carved in stone. The authority is depicted in the most energetic, the most dynamic, the most visually compelling military narrative in the history of Egyptian art. And the authority, like the temple itself, like the colossus itself, like the pharaoh himself, has been subject to the forces of erosion, earthquake, and time that erode everything. The Kadesh reliefs are damaged. The first pylon has partially collapsed. The gateway is supported by concrete. And the authority, the martial, divine, colossal authority of Ramesses II, speaks now not through the voice of power but through the voice of ruin, not less eloquently, but differently. The authority that speaks through ruin is a different authority from the authority that speaks through intact monuments. It is the authority of experience, of a monument that has been through the earthquake, that has been through the flood, that has been through 3,200 years of the forces that destroy everything, and that is still, despite everything, standing. Not perfectly, not completely, but standing. The deeper truth of the Ramesseum is the truth about what a mortuary temple actually was. Not merely a place of worship, but an economic institution, a logistical headquarters, a center of production and distribution that served the practical needs of a large and complex community. The mud brick structures that surround the Ramesseum, the vaulted storerooms, the granaries, the workshops, the kitchens, are in many respects as significant as the stone temple they surround. These subsidiary buildings, which extend in all directions from the main temple, constitute one of the most extensive and best preserved examples of ancient Egyptian institutional architecture. The vaulted storerooms are particularly notable. Their barrel-vaulted ceilings, constructed from mud brick, laid in a technique that required no wooden formwork, are among the oldest surviving true arches in the world. The technique, in which each course of brick is laid at a slight angle to the previous one, creating a self-supporting arch that does not require temporary scaffolding, is an engineering innovation that predates the Roman use of the arch by more than 1,000 years. The granaries were the economic engine of the Ramesseum. They stored the grain, wheat and barley, that was produced on the temple's agricultural estates, and that funded the temple's daily operations. The grain was used to feed the priests, the craftsmen, the laborers, and the other personnel who worked at the temple. It was used to produce the bread and the beer that were offered to the gods in the daily ritual, and it was used as a medium of exchange, a form of currency that could be traded for other goods and services that the temple required. The numbers are striking. The Ramesseum's granaries could store enough grain to feed approximately 20,000 people for a year, a capacity that made the temple not merely a religious institution but an economic powerhouse capable of sustaining a population the size of a small city. The economic power of the temple was not incidental to its religious function. It was integral to it. The temple's ability to produce, store, and distribute grain was the material basis of its religious authority, the practical foundation on which the spiritual superstructure was built. Let that sink in. The Ramesseum was not merely a temple. It was a distribution center, a warehouse, a bakery, a brewery, a workshop, and a granary, all integrated into a single institutional framework, all dedicated to the service of a dead pharaoh, whose cult required, for its maintenance, the daily production and distribution of food, drink, linen, incense, and the other commodities that the daily ritual consumed. The temple was a factory that produced the offerings that sustained the pharaoh's car and that employed hundreds of workers whose livelihoods depended on the temple's continued operation. A cache of papyri and ostraca discovered at the Ramesseum, dating to the Third Intermediate Period, roughly the 11th to the 8th centuries BC, indicates that the temple complex also functioned as a scribal school. The papyri include literary texts, mathematical exercises, and administrative documents that were used as training materials for scribes in training. The discovery suggests that the Ramesseum, even after the end of the New Kingdom, continued to function as an institutional center, not merely as a temple but as a school, a library, and a center of intellectual activity. The comparison between the Ramesseum and the Temple of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu, located roughly 1 kilometer to the south, is one of the most instructive contrasts in the Theban necropolis. Ramesses III, who ruled roughly 70 years after Ramesses II, consciously modelled his mortuary temple on the Ramesseum, adopting its general plan, imitating its decorative program, and attempting to match its scale. But Medinet Habu is far better preserved than the Ramesseum. Its walls are standing, its pylons are intact, its reliefs are legible. Its mud brick enclosure wall, with its distinctive fortified gateway, is the most complete surviving example of a temple enclosure in the Theban necropolis. The difference in preservation is primarily a matter of location. Medinet Habu is positioned on slightly higher ground than the Ramesseum, a few meters higher, but enough to reduce the impact of the annual Nile flood on the temple's foundations. The higher ground meant drier foundations, which meant less moisture damage, which meant more stable walls, which meant fewer collapses, which meant better preservation. The difference is small, a few meters of elevation, but the consequence is enormous. The difference between a well-preserved temple and a ruined one, between a building that still functions as a visual spectacle and a building that functions primarily as a meditation on impermanence. The lesson is that preservation is not a function of quality. It is a function of circumstance, of location, of elevation, of the specific geological and hydrological conditions of the site. The Ramesseum was not worse built than Medinet Habu, it was worse located. And the location. The low-lying floodplain, the saturated foundations, the annual cycle of wetting and drying, determined the temple's fate more decisively than the quality of its construction or the ambition of its builder. This lesson is relevant to the broader history of monument survival, a history in which the survival of the greatest achievements is often determined by factors that have nothing to do with their quality. The finest manuscripts are lost to fire, the greatest buildings are destroyed by earthquake, the most important archives are dissolved by flood. Survival is not a reward for excellence. It is a product of circumstance, of the specific, contingent, often accidental conditions under which the object exists. The Ramesseum's poor preservation is not a comment on the quality of its construction. It is a comment on the contingency of survival, the dependence of endurance on conditions that the builder cannot control and that the conservator can only partially mitigate. The Ramesseum's relationship with the other mortuary temples of the Theban necropolis illuminates the competitive dynamics of pharaonic monument building. Each pharaoh of the New Kingdom built his mortuary temple on the West Bank, each one attempting to surpass his predecessor, each one seeking to build bigger, more elaborate, more magnificently decorated than the one before. The sequence, from Hatshepsut's terraced masterpiece at Deir el-Bahari to Thutmose III's now-destroyed temple, to Amenhotep III's colossal complex, to Seti I's artistic triumph at Abydos, to Ramesses II's Ramesseum, to Ramesses III's Medinet Habu, is a sequence of escalating ambition, of progressive grandeur, of the relentless drive to build bigger that characterized the New Kingdom pharaohs. Ramesses II sat at the climax of this sequence, the pharaoh who built the most, who ruled the longest, who left the most extensive mark on the architectural landscape of Egypt. The Ramesseum was his entry in the competition, his bid to surpass his predecessors, his attempt to build the definitive mortuary temple, the temple that would establish the standard against which all future temples would be measured. The bid was partially successful. The Ramesseum was, at the time of its construction, one of the most impressive buildings on the West Bank, but it did not achieve the immortality that Ramesses intended. The temple's location doomed it to a cycle of damage and deterioration that has, over 32 centuries, reduced it to a dramatic but fragmentary ruin. The drama of the ruin is, paradoxically, one of the Ramesseum's greatest assets. The temple is more famous as a ruin than it could ever have been as an intact building. The fallen colossus, the scattered fragments, the empty courtyard, the roofless hypostyle hall, these are the images that have made the Ramesseum famous, that have inspired poets and artists, that have drawn visitors from across the world. The ruin is eloquent. The intact building would have been merely impressive, and the eloquence of the ruin, its capacity to speak, not of the pharaoh's power, but of power's limits, is the quality that has given the Ramesseum its unique place in the cultural imagination of the Western world. Shelley's Ozymandias is the most famous expression of this eloquence, but it is not the only one. The Ramesseum has inspired artists, writers, and philosophers for more than 2 centuries, from the painters of Napoleon's expedition, who documented the ruins in the Description de l'Egypte, to the romantic poets, who saw in the fallen colossus a metaphor for the vanity of human ambition, to the modern tourists who stand in the first courtyard, looking at the scattered fragments of the statue, and who feel, however briefly, however imperfectly, the weight of 3,200 years of silence. The silence is the Ramesseum's final offering, not the reliefs, not the columns, not the fallen colossus. The silence, the vast, empty, sun-baked silence of a temple that was built to sustain the voice of a pharaoh for millions of years, and that has been silent for 3,200. The pharaoh who built more monuments than any other, who inscribed his name on every available surface, who filled the Nile Valley with his face and his words, that pharaoh is now silent. His temple is in ruins, his statue is on the ground, and the silence, the specific, desert quiet Egyptian silence of a mortuary temple that has ceased to perform its rituals, fills the hypostyle hall, the courtyard, the pylon, the storerooms, and the empty field that was once the largest collection of vaulted mud brick magazines in the ancient world. The silence is not sad, it is not tragic, it is simply real, the natural condition of every monument, once the voices that filled it have departed and the rituals that sustained it have ceased. The Ramesseum's silence is the silence of all ruins, the silence that follows the departure of the people who built the building and the people who used it. The silence is not a failure, it is a fact. And the fact, the simple, universal, unavoidable fact that every building will eventually fall silent, is the deepest truth that the Ramesseum has to teach. The truth is not Shelley's truth. Not the truth of vanity, not the truth of irony, not the truth of the mighty humbled by time. The truth is gentler than that. The truth is that buildings are temporary, that monuments are temporary, that the works of even the greatest builders are, in the end, subject to the same forces of erosion, earthquake, and time that destroy everything else. The truth is not a rebuke to ambition. It is a statement of reality, a reality that the Ramesseum embodies more completely, more eloquently, more beautifully than any other building in the Theban necropolis. Shelley's Ozymandias has become so closely associated with the Ramesseum that the poem and the temple are now inseparable in the cultural imagination, each one illuminating the other, each one gaining significance from its association with the other. But the relationship between the poem and the temple is more complex than it might appear. Shelley almost certainly never visited the Ramesseum. He wrote the poem in England, based on secondary sources. Diodorus Siculus's account, Belzoni's reports, and the general awareness of Egyptian antiquities that was current in early 19th century European intellectual life. The poem is not a description of a specific monument. It is a meditation on a theme, the theme of impermanence, of the vanity of power, of the silence that swallows the boasts of kings. The Ramesseum is the occasion for the meditation, it is not the subject. The distinction matters because the poem's moral, "Nothing beside remains," is not strictly accurate as a description of the Ramesseum. Something does remain. 29 columns remain. The Kadesh reliefs remain. The Osirid pillars remain. The vaulted storerooms remain. The astronomical ceiling remains. The fallen colossus remains. 1,000 tons of red granite scattered across the first courtyard, massive and imposing even in ruin. The Ramesseum is not nothing. It is a substantial, archaeologically significant, artistically important, architecturally innovative monument. A monument that has survived for 3,200 years, and that will, with proper conservation, survive for thousands more. Shelley's nothing is a poetic exaggeration, a distortion of the reality for the sake of the moral. The distortion is effective. The poem is one of the most powerful meditations on impermanence in the English language. But the distortion is a distortion nonetheless, and the visitor who comes to the Ramesseum expecting nothing beside remains will find instead a great deal remaining. The 29 columns of the hypostyle hall are not nothing. The Kadesh reliefs are not nothing. The vaulted storerooms are not nothing. The Ramesseum's remains are substantial, more substantial than the poem suggests, more impressive than the poem allows, more eloquent than the poem's reductive moral can accommodate. The relationship between the literary and the archaeological is one of the most interesting features of the Ramesseum's cultural history. The temple has been experienced for more than 2 centuries, primarily through the lens of Shelley's poem, through the moral of impermanence, through the image of the fallen colossus, through the lone and level sands that the poem places around the ruin. The poem has shaped the visitor's expectations. The poem has framed the visitor's experience. And the poem, with its powerful, reductive, morally charged imagery, has in some respects obscured the temple. The visitor who comes looking for Shelley's Ozymandias may miss the Ramesseum, the actual physical, archaeologically complex temple that lies beneath the poem's literary surface. The archaeological reality of the Ramesseum is richer and more nuanced than the poem suggests. The temple is not merely a monument to the vanity of power. It is a monument to the complexity of the ancient Egyptian institutional system, a system that combined religious ritual, economic production, administrative management, military commemoration, and architectural innovation in a single building. The Ramesseum is a mortuary temple, a granary, a workshop, a school, a palace, and a military archive, all in one. The reduction of this complexity to a single moral, "Look on my works and despair," is a poetic achievement. It is also an intellectual loss. The poem captures the feeling of the ruin. It misses the substance. The substance is what the archaeologist adds. The archaeologist who studies the Ramesseum does not see a metaphor. The archaeologist sees a building with a plan, a construction history, a decorative program, an institutional function, an economic base, and a relationship to the landscape, the river, and the other temples of the Theban necropolis. The archaeologist sees the vaulted storerooms and understands them as examples of early arch technology. The archaeologist sees the Battle of Kadesh reliefs and understands them as historical documents, as propaganda tools, as artistic compositions. The archaeologist sees the fallen colossus and understands it as evidence of seismic activity, of transportation logistics, of quarrying technology, of the pharaoh's self-presentation program. The difference between the poet's and the archaeologist's perspectives is not a conflict. It is a complementarity, 2 ways of seeing the same object, each one revealing aspects that the other misses. The poet sees the meaning, the archaeologist sees the mechanism. The poet sees the silence, the archaeologist sees the structure. And the visitor who brings both perspectives, who reads Shelley before the visit, and who reads the archaeological guidebook during it, will experience the Ramesseum most fully. The temple is both the metaphor and the mechanism, both the silence and the structure, both the poem and the building. And the richest experience of the Ramesseum is the experience that holds both together, that sees the fallen colossus as both a meditation on impermanence and a 1,000-ton engineering project, that sees the hypostyle hall as both a roofless gallery and a clerestory-lit sacred space, that sees the vaulted storerooms as both the remnants of a vanished economy and the oldest surviving arches in the world. The Ramesseum is not merely what Shelley said it was, it is also what the archaeologists have shown it to be. And the combination, the literary and the archaeological, the poetic and the scientific, the moral and the material, is the full reality of the temple. The Ramesseum is impermanent. It is also substantial. It is a ruin. It is also a monument. It is a metaphor. It is also a building. And the building, the actual, physical, stone and mud brick building that has been standing on the west bank of the Nile for 3,200 years, deserves to be known not merely as the subject of a poem, but as one of the most significant, most complex, and most instructive monuments in the history of ancient Egypt. The economic dimension of the Ramesseum, its function as a production and distribution center, connects to one of the most important and most underappreciated aspects of ancient Egyptian civilization, the temple as economic institution. The temples of ancient Egypt were not merely houses of worship, They were the primary economic institutions of the country, the organizations that owned the land, that employed the labor, that produced the goods, that stored the surplus, and that distributed the wealth that sustained the Egyptian population. The temples collectively controlled a significant percentage of Egypt's agricultural land. Some estimates suggest as much as 30% of the total cultivable area, and their economic power was, at times, sufficient to rival the power of the pharaoh himself. The Ramesseum's granaries illustrate this economic power in physical form. The vaulted magazines, long, narrow, mud-brick chambers arranged in rows, their barrel-vaulted ceilings rising to a height of 4 or 5 meters, were designed to store grain in quantities sufficient to feed tens of thousands of people. The capacity of the granaries has been estimated by archaeologists who have measured the dimensions of the surviving structures and calculated the volume of grain that they could hold. The estimates vary, but the consensus is that the Ramesseum's granaries could store enough grain to feed roughly 15 to 20,000 people for an entire year, a capacity that made the temple one of the largest grain storage facilities in the Theban region. The grain was produced on the temple's agricultural estates, parcels of land that had been dedicated to the temple by the pharaoh and that were managed by the temple's administrative hierarchy. The estates were distributed across the Theban region, some of them located at considerable distances from the temple. The grain was harvested by the estate workers, transported to the temple by boat or by donkey, weighed and recorded by the temple's scribes, and stored in the granaries for distribution throughout the year. The distribution was managed by a hierarchy of officials: the overseer of the granary, the scribe of the granary, the porters and the measurers, each one responsible for a specific stage of the storage and distribution process. The distribution of grain from the temple's granaries served multiple purposes. First, it funded the daily ritual, the offerings of bread, beer, and other grain-based products that were presented to the cult statues every day. Second, it paid the temple's employees, the priests, the scribes, the craftsmen, the laborers, and the other personnel who worked at the temple. Payment was in kind. Grain was the currency of the temple economy, and the employees received their wages in the form of rations, fixed quantities of grain, distributed at regular intervals, sufficient to feed the employee and their family. Third, the surplus grain was available for exchange, for trading with other institutions, for purchasing goods and services that the temple could not produce itself, for accumulating the economic reserves that sustained the temple during lean years. The system of payment in kind, the ration system, was the foundation of the temple economy. The system was simple in principle. The temple produced grain, the employees received grain, and the grain served as the medium of exchange for virtually all economic transactions. The system was effective. It had sustained the Egyptian temple economy for centuries, and it would continue to sustain it for centuries more. But the system was also vulnerable to disruptions in grain production, caused by low floods, by drought, or by political instability, vulnerable to corruption, caused by officials who diverted grain from the temple's stores to their own use, and vulnerable to the gradual decline of the temple's institutional base, caused by the reassignment of agricultural estates, the dispersal of the priesthood, or the discontinuation of the daily ritual. The famous strikes of the Theban workmen during the 20th dynasty, documented in papyri from Deir el-Medina, the village of the royal tomb builders, were caused by failures in the ration distribution system. The workmen, who depended on regular grain deliveries from the temple granaries for their survival, stopped working when the deliveries failed to arrive. The strikes, which occurred during the reigns of Ramesses III and his successors, were symptoms of a systemic failure, the failure of the temple economy to produce and distribute sufficient grain to feed its dependents. The failure was not accidental. It was the product of political corruption, administrative mismanagement, and the gradual decline of royal authority that characterized the late Ramesside period. The Ramesseum's granaries, then, are not merely architectural curiosities. They are the physical remains of an economic system. A system that sustained one of the most complex civilizations in the ancient world, that fed tens of thousands of people that funded the daily ritual that maintained the cosmic order, and that ultimately failed. Not because the system was flawed, but because the political and administrative structures that maintained it were undermined by corruption, by instability, and by the simple passage of time. The Ramesseum's position within the broader landscape of the Theban necropolis is significant. The temple is located roughly midway between two of the best preserved mortuary temples on the west bank, the Temple of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahari to the north, and the Temple of Ramesses the Third at Medinet Habu to the south. The three temples, Hatshepsut's, Ramesses II's, and Ramesses III's, form a sequence that spans roughly 3 centuries of New Kingdom history, and that illustrates the evolution of mortuary temple architecture from the innovative terrace design of Deir el-Bahari to the conventional axial plan of the Ramesseum to the fortress-like enclosure of Medinet Habu. The sequence is also a sequence of preservation, from the well-preserved Deir el-Bahari, protected by its cliff-face position, to the poorly preserved Ramesseum, vulnerable on the floodplain, to the superbly preserved Medinet Habu, protected by its higher elevation and its massive mud-brick enclosure wall. The sequence demonstrates, once again, that preservation is a function of location rather than of quality, that the finest building is not necessarily the best preserved, that the most ambitious project is not necessarily the most durable, and that the pharaoh who builds the most does not necessarily leave the most behind. Ramesses II built the most. He left less behind than Hatshepsut, who built less. He left less behind than Ramesses III, who modelled his temple on the Ramesseum, but who chose a better location. The irony is consistent. The irony of the Ramesseum, the irony of Ozymandias, the irony of the pharaoh whose boast about the permanence of his works has been contradicted more comprehensively than any other pharaoh's boast by the impermanence of the works themselves. The west bank of Thebes, the landscape in which the Ramesseum sits, is itself a monument to this irony. The West Bank is a necropolis, a city of the dead, a landscape devoted to the preservation of the past, a collection of temples and tombs that were built to last forever. And the West Bank is also a ruin field, a landscape of collapsed walls, toppled statues, buried foundations, and scattered fragments that testify to the failure of the preservation project. The temples were built to last forever. They have lasted for 3,000 years. 3,000 years is not forever, and the gap between the intention and the reality, between the millions of years that were planned and the 3,000 that have elapsed, is the gap that the West Bank embodies, the gap that the Ramesseum embodies, the gap that Shelley's poem articulates, and the gap that every visitor to the West Bank feels. The gap between what was built and what remains, between what was intended and what was achieved, between the ambition and the silence. Stand in the hypostyle hall. The 29 surviving columns rise around you, their papyrus capitals casting shadows on the stone floor, their surfaces decorated with the reliefs and inscriptions that Ramesses craftsmen carved more than 3,200 years ago. The hall is open to the sky, the roof has collapsed, and the light that once entered through the clerestory windows now floods the space from above, illuminating the columns and the walls with a brightness that the original builders never intended. The brightness changes the experience. The hypostyle hall was designed to be dark, a dim, enclosed, atmospheric space in which the divine presence was felt rather than seen. The collapse of the roof has converted the hall from a dark interior into a bright exterior, from a sacred space of mystery and enclosure into an open-air gallery of stone columns and carved reliefs. The conversion is destructive. It has destroyed the atmospheric qualities that the builders designed, but it is also revealing. It exposes the reliefs to the full Egyptian sunlight, making them visible in a clarity and a detail that the original worshippers, standing in the dim interior, could never have experienced. The reliefs on the hypostyle columns depict scenes that are standard in New Kingdom temple decoration. The pharaoh making offerings to the gods, receiving divine blessings, performing the rituals that sustained the cosmic order. The scenes are conventional, the execution is competent, but the execution is not exceptional, not the equal of the reliefs at Seti's temple at Abydos, which was built by Ramesses's own father. and which contains the finest raised relief in Egyptian art. The Ramesseum's reliefs are carved in sunk relief, the technique that Ramesses preferred, which is bolder, faster, and more durable than the raised relief favored by his father, but which lacks the delicacy, the subtlety, and the emotional depth that make Seti's reliefs the acknowledged masterpiece of Egyptian temple art. The comparison between father and son, between Seti's raised relief and Ramesses's sunk relief, between the whisper and the shout, between beauty and power, is one of the most instructive contrasts in the history of Egyptian art. Seti chose quality, Ramesses chose quantity. Seti built fewer monuments but decorated them with the finest art available. Ramesses built more monuments but decorated them with art that was competent rather than extraordinary. The father's art is intimate, refined, and emotionally profound. The son's art is bold, dramatic, and politically effective. Both approaches are valid. Both serve their intended purpose. But the contrast, visible in the reliefs, measurable in the carving technique, palpable in the emotional register of the two traditions, illuminates a fundamental choice that every builder must make. The choice between doing fewer things beautifully and doing many things adequately. Ramesses chose the latter. He chose quantity. He chose scale. He chose the strategy of overwhelming the viewer with the sheer volume of his construction. Temples, statues, inscriptions, reliefs spread across the entire length of the Nile Valley, inscribed on every available surface, asserting his presence at every sacred site in Egypt. The strategy was effective. Ramesses is the most famous pharaoh in Egyptian history. His name is the most recognized, his face is the most reproduced, his monuments are the most numerous. But the strategy came at a cost, the cost of quality. The Ramesseum's reliefs are good, they are not great. And the fallen Colossus, the 1,000-ton granite statue that Shelley transformed into a poem about the vanity of ambition, is, in its ruined state, a more powerful monument than any of the intact statues that Ramesses erected at his other temples. The relationship between Ramesses II and his father Seti I is one of the most significant father-son dynamics in Egyptian history. And it is a dynamic that plays out architecturally in the contrasting styles and strategies of their respective temples. Seti built the finest temple, Ramesses built the most temples. Seti chose quality, Ramesses chose quantity. Seti's reliefs at Abydos are raised, delicate, refined, emotionally profound. Ramesses's reliefs at the Ramesseum are sunk, bold, efficient, politically effective. The father whispered, the son shouted. And both strategies, the whisper and the shout, the refined and the colossal, serve the same fundamental purpose, the establishment and maintenance of dynastic legitimacy. But the two strategies had different consequences for the long-term reception of their monuments. Seti's temple at Abydos is admired for its beauty. Ramesses's Ramesseum is admired for its scale. Seti's temple moves the viewer through the refinement of its craftsmanship. Ramesses's temple overwhelms the viewer through the magnitude of its ambition. The two experiences are different, and the difference reflects the different personalities and the different political situations of the two pharaohs. Seti needed to establish legitimacy. His art was his argument. The beauty of his reliefs was the evidence of divine favor. Ramesses had inherited his father's legitimacy. His art was his advertisement. The scale of his construction program was the proof of his power. The Ramesseum was designed by two named architects, Penre of Coptos and Amenemone of Abydos, whose existence is known from inscriptions at the temple and at other sites. The naming of the architects is unusual in Egyptian temple construction. Most Egyptian buildings are attributed exclusively to the pharaoh, with no mention of the professionals who designed and supervised the work. The naming of Penre and Amenemone suggests that they were particularly distinguished practitioners, architects whose reputation was sufficient to earn them the rare honor of being named in the building's inscriptions. The plan of the Ramesseum follows the standard layout of New Kingdom mortuary temples, an axial progression from east to west, from the profane to the sacred, from the bright exterior to the dark interior. The first pylon marks the eastern entrance. The first courtyard contains the fallen Colossus. The second pylon marks the transition to the second courtyard, with its Osirid portico. The hypostyle hall, beyond the second courtyard, marks the transition to the covered interior, and the sanctuary at the western end of the axis marks the sacred center, the darkest, most enclosed, most restricted space in the building. The axial progression is not merely architectural, it is theological, a physical journey that replicates the spiritual journey from the world of the living to the world of the dead. The first pylon is the boundary of the sacred precinct. The courtyards are the transitional spaces, public enough to accommodate festival crowds, sacred enough to require ritual purity. The hypostyle hall is the threshold of the divine, the space where the human and the divine come closest to touching, where the priest enters the presence of the god, where the ordinary world gives way to the cosmic order. And the sanctuary is the divine center, the room where the god resides, where the statue receives its offerings, where the daily ritual maintains the pharaoh's existence in the afterlife. The Ramesseum's relationship to the Nile, the river that both sustained and threatened the temple, is a central theme of the building's history. The temple was built on the west bank of the Nile, on the floodplain, at a location that was both prestigious and vulnerable. The prestige derived from the visibility. The temple could be seen from the river, from the east bank, from the approaching processions of the beautiful festival of the valley. The vulnerability derived from the flooding, the annual inundation of the Nile, which deposited fertile silt on the agricultural land, but which also saturated the temple's foundations, weakened its mud brick subsidiary structures, and contributed to the gradual deterioration of its stone superstructure. The beautiful festival of the valley, the annual procession in which the statue of Amun was carried from Karnak across the Nile to visit the mortuary temples of the West Bank, was the most important event in the Ramesseum's liturgical calendar. During the festival, the statue of Amun, carried in its sacred bark by a procession of priests, crossed the Nile from east to west, from the temple of Karnak to the Theban necropolis. The procession visited each mortuary temple in turn, presenting the statue of Amun to the cult statues of the deceased pharaohs, renewing the divine relationship between the living god and the dead kings. The Ramesseum was one of the principal stops on this processional route, a building that received the statue of Amun annually, that hosted the festival celebrations, and that served as a venue for the communal feasting, drinking, and merrymaking that accompanied the festival. The festival was not merely a religious event, it was a social event, a holiday, a carnival, a day of public celebration in which the boundaries between the sacred and the profane were temporarily dissolved. The participants consumed food and drink in quantities that were, by the standards of Egyptian temple festivals, considerable. The festival provided an occasion for the distribution of food from the temple's granaries to the wider community, a distribution that served both a practical function, feeding the population, and a political function, demonstrating the pharaoh's generosity and his temple's economic power. The Ramesseum's granaries, the vaulted mud brick magazines that surrounded the temple, were the material basis of this generosity. The granaries stored the surplus grain that the temple's agricultural estates produced, grain that was distributed to the temple's employees throughout the year and that was made available to the wider community during festivals. The distribution was not charity, it was patronage, a system of reciprocal obligation in which the temple provided food and the community provided labor, devotion, and political support. The system was the economic engine of the mortuary cult, the mechanism that converted agricultural surplus into ritual service, that transformed grain into offerings, that turned the products of the earth into the sustenance of the dead. The system failed. The Ramesseum's cult was not maintained for millions of years, as the pharaoh intended. It was maintained for a few centuries, perhaps 300 or 400 years after Ramesses's death, before the political disruptions of the late New Kingdom and the Third Intermediate Period undermined the temple's institutional base. The agricultural estates were reassigned, the priesthood was dispersed, the daily ritual was discontinued, and the temple, stripped of its institutional purpose, deprived of its economic base, exposed to the floods and the earthquakes that the maintenance staff was no longer present to mitigate, began the long decline that has continued for 3,000 years. the decline was not immediate. The temple continued to function in some capacity well into the Third Intermediate period. The scribal school, the craft workshops, and the administrative offices operated for centuries after the mortuary cult had ceased. The mud brick storerooms, which had been built to store the temple's grain, were repurposed for other uses, as workshops, as dwellings, as storage for the goods of the community that continued to live in and around the temple complex. The repurposing is evidence of the temple's institutional resilience, its capacity to adapt, to find new functions, to continue serving the community, even after its original purpose had expired. But the adaptation was temporary. Eventually, centuries later, millennia later, even the repurposed functions ceased. The workshops closed, the dwellings were abandoned, the storerooms collapsed, and the temple of millions of years, the house of Ozymandias, the most ambitious architectural project of the most prolific builder in Egyptian history, was left to the floods and the earthquakes and the quarrying and the slow, patient, relentless forces of entropy that have been dismantling it, stone by stone, brick by brick, for 3,200 years. The diplomatic achievements of Ramesses II, which are commemorated at the Ramesseum alongside his military achievements, represent one of the most significant developments in the international relations of the ancient Near East. The Treaty of Kadesh, signed with the Hittite king Hattusili III in 1258 BC, was not merely a peace agreement. It was a comprehensive diplomatic settlement, a treaty of mutual non-aggression, mutual defense, and mutual extradition that established the framework for Egyptian-Hittite relations for the remainder of both empires' existence. The treaty was recorded in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hittite cuneiform, making it one of the first bilingual diplomatic documents in history, and copies were exchanged between the two courts, each copy bearing the seals of both rulers. The significance of the treaty extends beyond the specific terms of the agreement. The treaty represents a fundamental shift in Ramesses's political strategy, a transition from military confrontation to diplomatic accommodation, from the attempt to conquer the Hittite Empire by force to the acceptance of a bipolar international system in which Egypt and Hatti coexisted as equal powers. The shift was pragmatic. The Battle of Kadesh had demonstrated that neither side could achieve a decisive military victory, and the prolonged conflict was draining the resources of both empires. The treaty was not a sign of weakness. It was a sign of maturity, the recognition that diplomacy could achieve what war could not, that a negotiated settlement was preferable to an indefinite military stalemate, and that the pharaoh's greatness could be expressed through peacemaking as well as through conquest. The royal marriage that sealed the treaty, Ramesses's marriage to a Hittite princess, recorded in both Egyptian and Hittite sources and commemorated in reliefs at Abu Simbel and at the Ramesseum, was one of the most elaborate diplomatic marriages in ancient history. The Hittite princess, given the Egyptian name Mathor-Neferu, was escorted from the Hittite capital to Egypt by a large retinue, accompanied by a spectacular dowry of gold, silver, precious stones, and manufactured goods. The journey, from Hattusa in central Anatolia to Pi-Ramesses in the Egyptian delta, covered more than 1,500 kilometers and took several months. The marriage was celebrated with extravagant festivities, and the princess was installed in the royal harem with the title of Great Royal Wife. The commemoration of the marriage at the Ramesseum, in reliefs that show the Hittite princess being presented to Ramesses, is significant because it demonstrates the pharaoh's willingness to present his diplomatic achievements alongside his military ones. The Ramesseum's decorative program is dominated by the Battle of Kadesh, the military engagement that Ramesses considered the defining event of his reign. But the treaty and the marriage are also present, acknowledged, if not celebrated, as achievements that contributed to the pharaoh's glory and to the stability of Egypt's position in the international order. The Ramesseum's location within the Theban necropolis connects it to the broader system of mortuary temples that lined the west bank of the Nile from Deir el-Bahari in the north to Medinet Habu in the south. The mortuary temples were not isolated buildings. They were nodes in a network, connected by processional routes, linked by shared festivals, and coordinated through a calendar that synchronized the activities of multiple temples across the West Bank. The beautiful Festival of the Valley, which has already been mentioned, was the most important of these shared events, a festival that connected all of the mortuary temples in a single processional route, linking the living god, Amun, at Karnak with the dead pharaohs in their mortuary temples on the West Bank. The Ramesseum's participation in this network was central to its identity. The temple was not merely a self-contained institution, it was a member of a community of temples, a community that shared festivals, shared processional routes, shared economic relationships, and shared the fundamental purpose of maintaining the pharaoh's afterlife through the performance of daily and annual rituals. The community was hierarchical. The most important temples, those of the most recent and most powerful pharaohs, received the most resources, the most attention, and the most prominent position on the processional route. The Ramesseum, as the temple of the most powerful pharaoh of the 19th dynasty, occupied a prominent position in this hierarchy, a position that was reflected in the scale of its construction, the quality of its decoration, and the size of its economic endowment. The concept of the mortuary temple as a temple of millions of years, the designation that Ramesses used for the Ramesseum, reflects the Egyptian belief that the mortuary cult could and should be maintained forever. The term millions of years was not a metaphor. It was a literal expectation. The pharaoh expected his cult to be maintained for millions of years, his temple to stand for millions of years, his name to be spoken for millions of years. The expectation was, of course, unrealistic. No human institution can be maintained for millions of years. No building can stand for millions of years. No name can be spoken for millions of years. But the expectation was sincere, and the temple, with its massive stone construction, its endowed lands, its hereditary priesthood, and its comprehensive institutional structure, was designed to fulfill the expectation as fully as human capability allowed. The gap between the expectation and the reality, between the millions of years that were intended and the few centuries that the cult actually functioned, is the fundamental tension of the Ramesseum. The building was designed to last forever. It has lasted for 3,200 years. 3,200 years is a long time, longer than the history of most nations, longer than the lifespan of most institutions, longer than the memory of most civilizations. But 3,200 years is not millions, and the gap between the 3,200 and the millions is the space in which the Ramesseum's meaning resides. The meaning is not despair. The meaning is not vanity. The meaning is not the Shelleyan moral that nothing beside remains. The meaning is something quieter, something more nuanced, something more honest than any of these literary formulations. The meaning is simply this: 3,200 years is a very long time. It is not millions of years, but it is enough. It is enough to have preserved the reliefs, the columns, the storerooms, the fallen colossus, and the memory of the pharaoh who built them. It is enough to have inspired one of the most famous poems in the English language. It is enough to have attracted visitors from across the world to a ruined temple on the west bank of the Nile, where they stand among the fragments of a 1,000-ton granite statue and think, however briefly, about the relationship between ambition and time. 3,200 years is not millions, but it is enough, and the Ramesseum, the temple of millions of years, the house of Ozymandias, the ruin that endures, has made the most of it. The vulnerability of the Ramesseum to Nile flooding was not a design flaw, it was a theological choice. The Egyptian mortuary temple was, by tradition, positioned on the west bank of the Nile, in the flood plain, at the edge of the cultivated land. This position was theologically significant. The West Bank was the realm of the setting sun, the land of the dead, the space between the living world of the valley and the dead world of the desert. The mortuary temple occupied this liminal space, bridging the boundary between the cultivated and the desert, between the green and the brown, between the fertile and the barren. The position was symbolically rich. It was also physically dangerous. The danger was understood. The Egyptian builders knew that the floodplain was subject to annual inundation. They designed their temples to withstand the flood, raising the stone foundations above the expected water level, using mud brick for subsidiary structures that could be rebuilt when damaged. and orienting the temples with their entrances facing east, away from the flood's direction of approach. But the designs were not always adequate. The Nile flood was variable, higher in some years than in others, unpredictable in its exact height and duration. In years of exceptional flooding, the water exceeded the design tolerance and reached surfaces that were not intended to be submerged. Over centuries, the cumulative damage of these exceptional floods, combined with the constant, low-level damage of the average floods, weakened the temples beyond the capacity of the maintenance crews to repair. The Ramesseum suffered this cumulative damage more severely than some of its neighbours, and the reason was, once again, location. The specific position of the Ramesseum on the floodplain was slightly lower than the positions of some of the other mortuary temples. Medinet Habu, for example, was built on ground that was several meters higher, sufficient to reduce the impact of all but the most exceptional floods. The difference in elevation was small, but the consequence was large. The Ramesseum was flooded more frequently, more deeply, and more damagingly than its higher positioned neighbour. The water saturated the foundations more completely, the mud brick dissolved more rapidly, the sandstone weathered more quickly, and the temple, which was built to the same standards of construction as Medinet Habu, deteriorated significantly faster. The modern experience of visiting the Ramesseum is shaped by the temple's position within the standard tourist itinerary of the Theban West Bank. Most visitors to the West Bank arrive by bus or taxi from Luxor, crossing the Nile by the modern bridge and driving through the flat, agricultural landscape of the floodplain. The standard itinerary includes the Valley of the Kings, the Temple of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahari, and time permitting one or two additional sites: Medinet Habu, the Valley of the Queens, or the Ramesseum. The Ramesseum is, for many visitors, a secondary stop, a site that is worth seeing but that does not command the same attention or the same time allocation as the Valley of the Kings or Deir el-Bahari. This secondary status is in some respects undeserved. The Ramesseum has qualities that the more famous sites do not: the fallen colossus, the literary connection to Shelley, the vaulted storerooms with their early arch technology, the detailed Kadesh reliefs, the Osirid portico, the astronomical ceiling. The temple is, in its own right, a major archaeological monument, a site that repays careful exploration and that offers insights into the economic, military, and institutional dimensions of New Kingdom Egyptian civilization that the Valley of the Kings and Deir el-Bahari do not. The visitors who do spend time at the Ramesseum often find it the most emotionally affecting site on the West Bank. The combination of the surviving columns, the fallen colossus, the Kadesh reliefs, and the general atmosphere of ruin produces a response that is different from the response produced by more intact sites. At Karnak or Medinet Habu, the visitor admires the building. At the Ramesseum, the visitor mourns it, mourns the fallen statue, mourns the collapsed pylons, mourns the roofless hypostyle hall, mourns the granaries that once fed 20,000 people and that are now rows of stubby mud brick walls barely rising above the level of the surrounding ground. The mourning is the Ramesseum's gift, not its intention. Ramesses did not build his temple to be mourned. He built it to be admired. But the mourning is, paradoxically, a more valuable response than the admiration would have been. The admiration would have been for the pharaoh's power. The mourning is for the pharaoh's vulnerability, for the fact that even the most powerful, the most prolific, the most comprehensively monument-building pharaoh in Egyptian history was, in the end, subject to the same forces of destruction that destroy everything. The mourning humanizes the pharaoh, the ruin humanizes the monument, and the visitor, standing in the hypostyle hall, looking at the fallen colossus, feeling the weight of 3,200 years of silence, is closer to the reality of Ramesses's existence than any admirer of his intact monuments could ever be. The reality is that Ramesses was mortal. The reality is that his works were mortal. The reality is that the Temple of Millions of Years was a bet against time, and time won. The reality is written in the ruins, in the fallen colossus, in the collapsed pylons, in the roofless hall, in the 29 surviving columns that stand where 48 once stood. The ruins are the reality. The intact monuments, Abu Simbel, The additions to Karnak, the colossal statues that still stand at Memphis and elsewhere, are the exceptions. The rule is the ruin. The rule is the Ramesseum, and the Ramesseum, in its ruined state, tells the truth about Ramesses more honestly than any of his intact monuments. The truth is that he built magnificently. The truth is that he ruled for 66 years. The truth is that he signed the oldest peace treaty in history. The truth is that he fathered more than 100 children. The truth is that he was the most famous pharaoh in Egyptian history. And the truth, the final truth, the truth that the Ramesseum embodies, is that none of it lasted, not the way he intended, not for millions of years, not even for thousands of years in its original form. The temple is in ruins, the colossus is on the ground, the granaries are stubs, and the pharaoh, the great Ramesses Ozymandias, King of Kings, is dust in a museum case in Cairo, his mummified body displayed behind glass, his face wizened by 3,200 years of death, his mouth open in an expression that is sometimes described as a cry and sometimes as a smile, and that is, almost certainly, neither. The Ramesseum's place in the history of Egyptology is significant. The temple was one of the first Egyptian monuments to be described by modern European travellers, one of the first to be documented by Napoleon's expedition, one of the first to be correctly identified by Champollion, and one of the first to be the subject of a major literary work in English. The temple's archaeological history, from the early 19th century explorations of Belzoni to the modern excavations conducted by French and Egyptian teams, spans more than 2 centuries of continuous investigation, making the Ramesseum one of the most thoroughly studied monuments in the Theban necropolis. The French archaeological mission, which has been conducting systematic excavation and conservation at the Ramesseum since the 1990s, has produced a series of discoveries that have significantly expanded our understanding of the temple complex. The mission has uncovered evidence of pre-Ramesside occupation of the site, Middle Kingdom burials, and earlier structures that were present on the site before Ramesses's builders began their work. The discovery confirms that the site of the Ramesseum was sacred before Ramesses, that the pharaoh built his temple on ground that had already accumulated religious significance over centuries of use. The mission has also uncovered evidence of post-Ramesside occupation, the reuse of the temple's structures during the Third Intermediate Period, the Late Period, and the Roman era. The evidence includes domestic pottery, cooking installations, and residential modifications to the temple's subsidiary buildings, indicating that the temple complex, even after the cessation of the pharaoh's mortuary cult, continued to serve as a living space for the community that inhabited the site. The continuity of occupation, from the pre-Ramesside burials through the temple's construction and use to the post-Ramesside domestic reuse, spans more than 2,000 years, making the site of the Ramesseum one of the most extensively and most continuously occupied locations in the Theban necropolis. The Middle Kingdom tomb discovered beneath the hypostyle hall, a shaft tomb cut into the bedrock before the temple was built, yielding a rich collection of funerary artifacts, is one of the most important individual discoveries from the site. The tomb, which was sealed by the construction of the temple's foundations, contained objects that were deposited at least 500 years before Ramesses's builders began their work. The objects include funerary figurines, cosmetic implements, jewelry, and pottery, a typical Middle Kingdom burial assemblage, representative of the period's material culture and funerary practices. The tomb's existence beneath the hypostyle hall demonstrates that the site was used for burial during the Middle Kingdom, roughly 1800 to 1500 BC, and that the construction of the Ramesseum obliterated or sealed earlier remains that are now accessible only through careful archaeological excavation. The Ramesseum's mud-brick enclosure wall, the massive boundary wall that surrounded the entire temple complex, is now largely destroyed but can be reconstructed from surviving sections and from archaeological evidence of its foundations. The wall was roughly 10 meters high and several meters thick at its base, a substantial defensive structure that defined at the boundary of the sacred precinct and that separated the temple from the surrounding agricultural land. The wall was built from sun-dried mud brick, the standard material for non-structural Egyptian architecture, and its surface was plastered and whitewashed to create a smooth, reflective surface that would have been visible from a considerable distance. The enclosure wall served multiple functions. First, it defined the sacred boundary, separating the consecrated ground of the temple from the profane ground of the surrounding landscape. Second, it provided security, protecting the temple's valuables, the gold, the ritual objects, the grain reserves, from theft and unauthorized access. Third, it controlled movement, channeling visitors and worshippers through designated gateways, ensuring that the approach to the temple followed the prescribed route and that unauthorized persons could not enter the sacred precinct. Fourth, it provided storage. The internal faces of the wall were built with incorporated niches and alcoves that could be used for the storage of administrative documents, ritual objects, and other temple property. The destruction of the enclosure wall, by flood erosion, by mud brick dissolution, by the reuse of its bricks by local builders, has significantly altered the visitor experience of the Ramesseum. In antiquity, the visitor would have approached the temple through a controlled entrance in the enclosure wall, passing through a gateway, crossing a threshold, entering a defined sacred space. The approach would have been gradual and sequential, from the profane to the sacred, from the outside to the inside, from the world of daily life to the world of the gods. The modern visitor approaches the temple without this boundary, walking across open ground, without a gateway, without a threshold, without the architectural transition that the enclosure wall was designed to provide. The absence of the enclosure wall changes the meaning of the Ramesseum. In antiquity, the temple was a walled precinct, an enclosed space, separated from the world, defined by its boundary, contained within its limits. The enclosure wall said, "This is sacred space. This is different from the world outside. Enter with reverence. Enter with purpose. Enter through the designated gateway, along the designated route, with the designated prayers and the designated ablutions." The modern Ramesseum has no wall, no gateway, no boundary. The temple is open to the wind, open to the light, open to the tourists and the stray dogs and the sugarcane farmers who pass it daily. The openness is a consequence of destruction. It is also a transformation, a conversion of the temple from a sacred enclosure to an open ruin, from a bounded space to an unbounded one, from a building with a purpose to a building without a function. The transformation is the Ramesseum's current condition. The temple is no longer a temple. It is a ruin that is also a monument, a tourist attraction, an archaeological site, a subject of scholarly investigation, and a literary landmark. The multiple identities of the Ramesseum, the archaeological, the literary, the touristic, the scholarly, coexist in the same physical space, each one overlaying the others, each one contributing to the complex, multi-layered experience of standing among the columns and the fragments and the silence of the temple of millions of years. The columns stand, the colossus lies, the poem endures, the silence holds. And the Ramesseum, the most ambitious, the most prolific, the most comprehensively monument-building pharaoh's most important temple, endures in its ruin, not as Ramesses intended, not for millions of years, but for 3,200, and counting. So what is the Ramesseum? It is the mortuary temple of Ramesses II, the most prolific builder in Egyptian history, the pharaoh who ruled for 66 years, who fought the Battle of Kadesh, who signed the oldest surviving peace treaty, who built Abu Simbel and expanded Karnak and filled the Nile Valley with monuments bearing his name and his face. The Ramesseum was his temple of millions of years, the building that was designed to sustain his cult for eternity, to house the rituals that would maintain his ka, to serve as the economic and institutional base for the perpetuation of his memory. The temple is in ruins, the pylons have collapsed, the courtyards are fragmentary, the colossus has fallen, the roof of the hypostyle hall is gone. The mud brick storerooms, the vaulted granaries, the workshops, the kitchens are reduced to foundations and stubs. The temple of millions of years has lasted for 3,200 years. It has not lasted for millions. It will not last for millions. Nothing lasts for millions. But the ruin speaks. The fallen colossus speaks. The surviving columns speak. The Battle of Kadesh reliefs speak. The vaulted storeroom speak, the papyri speak, and the poem, Shelley's poem, the 14 lines that have made the Ramesseum the most famous ruin in the world, speaks loudest of all. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. The despair is not for the works. The works are impressive, even in ruin, even in fragments, even scattered across a courtyard floor. The despair is for their impermanence, for the gap between the ambition and the reality, between the millions of years that were intended and the 3,200 that have elapsed, between the pharaoh's boast and the silence that has swallowed it. The silence is not complete. The Ramesseum still attracts visitors, fewer than Karnak, fewer than the Valley of the Kings, but enough to keep the site alive, enough to maintain the guards and the pathways and the interpretive signs that help the visitor understand what they are seeing. The visitors come to see the fallen colossus. They come to see the columns. They come to photograph the ruins and to think, however briefly, about the relationship between power and permanence, between ambition and time, between the pharaoh who built the most and the temple that has survived the least. The relationship is not what Shelley described. Shelley's poem presents the ruin as evidence of time's triumph over ambition. Nothing beside remains. But something does remain. The temple remains, damaged, fragmentary, half-collapsed, but present. The reliefs remain, readable, informative, artistically significant. The storerooms remain, their vaulted ceilings among the oldest arches in the world. The papyri remain, evidence of a scribal tradition that outlasted the pharaoh's cult by centuries. And the colossus remains, fallen, shattered, lying on its back in the courtyard, where it stood for 1,000 years before an earthquake brought it down. The colossus is not nothing. It is 1,000 tons of red granite, carved with the face of the most powerful pharaoh in Egyptian history, lying in the ruin of the temple he built to last forever. The ruin endures. The poem endures. The pharaoh endures. In his name, in his face, in the 1,000 tons of granite that lie in the courtyard of the temple that time is taking apart. And the lesson of the Ramesseum, the lesson of Ozymandias, the lesson of the pharaoh who built the most and whose temple has survived the least, endures with them. The lesson is not despair. The lesson is awareness. The awareness that everything we build is temporary, that every monument is a bet against time, and that time, patient and impartial, has never lost a bet. The columns stand, the colossus lies, the sun sets behind the Theban hills, and the Ramesseum, the temple of millions of years, the house of Ozymandias, the ruin that inspired the poem that taught the world the word impermanence, holds its silence in the gathering dark.